మన బండిలోకి ఎక్కువ ఉందా? Governor of Reserve Bank of India, Dr. D. Subbarao, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Freedom University, we invite the Director of Deakin School of International Business, Mr. V.K. Kumar, to grace the dais. We begin.
Today's chief guest, the distinguished son of India, Dr. D. Subbarao garu. I need not mention much about him, and we are proud of him. Today in the turbulent world, in the turbulent economy, the ablest person to handle the present situation can do only Subbarao, nothing else, nobody else. The policies that have been adopted by Dr. Subbarao, the Reserve Bank. I am sure we will overcome all these crises. The only problem today is inflation. I think the measures that what are being taken, certainly they will curtail the circulation, and to some extent the growth could be maintained as usual. The only thing is that again we hear very disturbing news about the US and Western countries about a very slowdown of economy and purchasing power. How to maintain our exports is a problem now. I think certainly this could be taken care of by Subbarao and the team, our finance minister. Thank you very much for coming, visiting today the Geetham sir. We are really honored to honor you here. And please come again and enthuse our international business students who wanted to occupy the financial sector all over the country. Thank you very much, sir. First of all, I want to thank President. So as I see young students here, my thoughts and memories go back to my own college days. All of you have some idea of math. If you draw an x-axis and put time t0 at one end and today's time at one end, the t0 is the discovery of fire.
and today's time is the invention of the iPad. My time in college was somewhere in between that, so you know how ancient I am. Stamps and put letters in an envelope and send them. So, and if you were looking for a web, we didn't click on a mouse. We stepped in the corner. So the world has changed a lot between your time and my time when we were students. India has changed too. India has become much more globalized than 20 years ago. In 1991, we initiated our economic reform process, and there were three guiding principles to that economic reform process. First was to dismantle the license permit Raj. Second was to open up India to the external sector. And third was to downsize the reliance on the public sector. So, at the time when I was a student and at the time you were students, a lot has changed around the world. A lot has changed in India too. Technology and globalization have changed the way we live, the way we think, the way we act, the way we work. What we did in 1991 was to open up India to globalization. But globalization is a double-edged sword. It has costs and it has benefits. The benefits we are experiencing today, we've experienced over the last 20 years. India has gotten to a higher growth trajectory, poverty has come down. But the costs also are there, some of them are invisible. One of the costs of globalization is the way we've been affected by the crisis. So, when you open up a country to globalization, you have both costs and benefits, and the idea should be to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs, so that the cost-benefit calculus is high. The reason I've chosen to talk about this, India and the global financial crisis, what we have learned, is to demonstrate to you really what the benefits and costs of globalization have been. The 2008-9 financial crisis, by all accounts, has been one of the deepest financial crises of our time. It's taken a devastating toll on global growth and welfare. When you talk to experts, they say that the fundamental causes of all crises are the same. They're global imbalances, easy accommodative policies, and the leverage, that is, people, companies, everybody borrowing too much. And that sets off an irrational exuberance, and that causes a crisis, which is exactly what happened in 2008. However, the crisis we had in 2008 is quite different from other past crises in three important ways. You remember we had over the last 20 years crises in Argentina, in Turkey, in Russia, in Mexico, across East Asia, the Asian crisis. All of them were different from the crisis of 2008 in three important respects. First, earlier crises were confined to one country or one part of the world, whereas this crisis was global. It engulfed the whole world. Side of banking, whereas the 2008 crisis originated from the wholesale side of banking. And third crisis, why was India hit by the crisis? Because of the time constraint. In fact, I'm not even sure if I'll be able to get through 8, but let's see how much I get through. I must add something on a personal note, which is that I took office as governor of the Reserve Bank on 5th September 2008, just about a month short of 3 years. Fannie and Freddie happened on the 7th of September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed on the 15th of September, and the whole world collapsed on the 16th of September 2008. So, in India and around the world, a lot of people think that I brought on the crisis. It's across I read. Then people ask me, when will the crisis be over? So I tell them when my term is going to be over, when the crisis is going to be over. Moving on to the first question, why was India hit by the crisis? Which is to tell you about the impact of the crisis on India. In the 3 years before the crisis, 2005 to 2008, we clocked growth of 9%. 9.5% per annum. In the crisis year, that growth had come down in 2008 to 6.8%. Our exports were expanding at 25% per year in the period before the crisis. In the crisis year, they came down to 12%, and the year after that, in 2009-10, they actually declined by 2%. There were a lot of capital flows, in fact, far in excess of what we needed. But during the crisis year, all of that went back. Not all of it, much of it. The capital started reversing. The rupee was very strong. The rupee went as high as 39 rupees to a dollar. In January 2008, it went down to 51 rupees to a dollar by March 2009. In a matter of 15 months, it depreciated by about 30%. So that was the impact of the crisis on India. The first round effects of the crisis hit us through the finance channel. It was that a lot of companies that were fully invested in India, when there was a crisis, people wanted to go home. They spiked to safety. That's exactly what happened. FIS, foreign institutional investors who invested a lot of money here, started paying it back. That hit our foreign exchange markets. A lot of corporates in India were borrowing abroad before the crisis. When the crisis broke, they found that lines of credit dried up. So they started coming back to India and demanding credit from domestic credit institutions. That put pressure on our credit markets. In the years before the crisis, a lot of corporates had money. They invested that in mutual funds, who in turn invested that in mutual funds, who in turn invested in non-bank finance companies, and as a whole big loop. So when they started falling back for that money, our non-bank finance companies, our mutual funds came under pressure. Because of what was happening around the world, the liquidity crunch, even our banks, though nothing really was happening here, we were quite safe. But even our banks became nervous and the money market started having hiccups. As a result, all our financial markets, our foreign exchange markets, our credit markets, our money markets, our debt markets, our equity markets, all of them came under pressure. Wells Fargo, Citi, UBS, one by one, every day, there was one storied institution that all of us have grown to live with. First they said, look, you're claiming that our banks are safe, that they did not have exposure to toxic assets. Their off-balance sheet activity was limited. They were quite well regulated. After all, this is a crisis that originated in the banking sector. So if your banks are safe, how come India is affected by the crisis? The second thing people used to say was that if the reason we were affected by the crisis, despite these mitigating factors, is because we were much more globalized than we tended to accept. India, over the last 20 years, as I said at the beginning, got integrated with the rest of the world. People's perception of India was shaped by the Asian crisis. The Asian crisis happened in 97, 98, 99. 10 years before this crisis, during the Asian crisis, India was much less integrated. But in the 10 years between the Asian crisis and the global financial crisis, we were much, much more integrated. Our trade integration was deep, our financial integration was deeper. I just want to give you just a bit of a sense of how closely we got integrated with the rest of the world. If you see those numbers, in the 10-year period between the Asian crisis and the global crisis, our exports and imports as a percentage of GDP doubled from 19.6 to 40.7%. That is trade integration. But the second row you see on the matrix there, which is two-way current and capital flows, which is both trade in goods and services, plus money flowing in and out. If you take that as a proportion of GDP, that is multiplied more than 2.5 times. So, in the period before the crisis, when there was a lot of liquidity around the world, they were all coming to India to invest here, and that's how we saw that our financial integration got deeper. So I answered two of those questions. how did we get into the crisis? Why did we get into the crisis? Now, let me answer the third question, which is how did we respond to the crisis? Very briefly, in October, November 2008, the government came up with a fiscal stimulus package, and the RBI eased the monetary policy. Many of the students here must have been in high school or early college at that time, 3 years ago. But if you go back 3 years, in the summer of 2008, we had very high inflation. In fact, the Reserve Bank, even before I went there, my predecessor had tightened policy. We were raising rates to fight inflation. Suddenly, we realized that we had to relax that policy and relax that in a short span of time, and that's what we did. We were guided by two factors in responding to the crisis. First, we said that our financial markets must function normally every day, and that the liquidity stress should not cascade into a solvency crisis. In fact, every morning during those months, September, October, November, our anxiety was to look at the TV, see if anything happened in East Asia. Then Indian markets would open, we'd see if there was how they responded, and overnight European and American markets would perform. So every day there was anxiety about what might happen in the global markets, how that might affect confidence, and how that might affect our fortunes. In tailoring our policy in the Reserve Bank, we were guided by three factors. First, we said that there must be ample liquidity in the market, rupee liquidity. There must be ample rupee liquidity. Second, there must be comfortable foreign exchange liquidity. And third, we must make sure that credit continues to flow to productive sectors. We were criticized, of course. There was a lot of criticism of the government and of the Reserve Bank. People said that we were being very timid rather than being bold. They said we were being hesitant rather than being confident. They said we were being reactive, reacting to the situation rather than anticipating the situation, proactively responding to that. And people said that familiar phrase, familiar now but not familiar then, which is that the Reserve Bank has always been behind the curve rather than being ahead of the curve, notwithstanding the fact that nobody knows what the shape of the curve is. But in tailoring our response, we believe that we must tailor our response depending on the Indian situation. Countries are doing different things depending on their own country situation. People used to come and say, or write in the media saying that Japan did this, Malaysia did this, UK did this, Germany did this, US did this, so we must do that too. But our thinking was that we must only do that which is necessary here. Let me give you an example. In the UK, there is deposit insurance. All of you know that, no? When you keep money in the bank, there is an insurance for that. In India, up to 1 lakh rupees. In the UK, what they did was that in the UK also there is deposit insurance. But in order to stabilize markets, in order to inspire confidence, what they did was they said we're insuring all the money there is in the bank, which is to ensure that there is no run on the bank system. Immediately, there was demand, there was expectation that we must do that in India too. Imagine if we did that in India, where there is no crisis, actually we would have triggered a crisis. Because people would have thought, there must be something wrong in our banking system. That is why the Reserve Bank has raised the deposits so much. So not only did we have to manage finance and the economy, we had to manage expectations and manage confidence, not just of the market players in Mumbai and other big cities, but ordinary people across the country. Now, about the post-crisis situation today, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this because this is very important for me to explain today's dilemma of the Reserve Bank. We recovered out of the crisis much sooner than other countries, actually. By about the summer of 2009, we found that we had deflation, then we found that inflation was catching up with us. So just as we got out of the crisis sooner than other countries, inflation also caught up with us sooner than other countries. In fact, until 2 months ago, they were still inflation of June. That's being driven by 3 factors. First is incomes have gone up. In rural India, incomes have gone up. People are eating better. They're shifting from cereal to crude prices for a number of factors. Again, I do not want to go into details, but crude prices and other commodity prices around the world have firmed up, and that's having an impact on our inflation. The third is demand, which is what I've said, which is that across rural areas in India, incomes have gone up, and that rising income is quickly translating into rising demand. You talk to any big corporate today, they say that we are focusing on rural India. They're not focusing on Hyderabad, Chennai, Visakhapatnam, or Calcutta. They're focusing on villages because that's where the market is. So these 3 drivers, structural food component, crude and commodity prices, and wage pressures and demand pressures are impinging on inflation. When we raise rates, there is always a dilemma, which is that you need to raise rates in order to restrain inflation. But if you raise rates, borrowing becomes more expensive for investors, and therefore growth comes down. So there is this trade-off between growth and inflation. But again, it's a very complex thing. There's not always a trade-off. There's not always a trade-off across the entire equation. But at that part of the curve where we are operating today, 9.4% inflation, growth last year of 8.5%, this year might be slightly lower. We need to raise rates in order to restrain inflation. That hurts growth. So people say, are you not hurting growth in order to contain inflation? Our response is that you need to restrain inflation in order to ensure that our medium-term growth is sustainable. In the short term, it might be quite possible to grow a little faster, but that comes at the cost of inflation. Inflation is a reprehensible, regressive tax everywhere. Even in America, they talk about inflation, and that hurts. But in a poor country like India, inflation hurts much more, because inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts the poor more than it hurts other people. So we try to balance this trade-off between growth and inflation. Our position is that in order to restrain inflation, you may have to sacrifice a bit of growth in the short term, but restraining inflation is very, very important in order for the economy to grow at higher than 8%, 9%, maybe even double digits in the medium term. The second dilemma we face is between savers and investors. When I go around the country, people say that, look, earlier they used to say that rates are not high enough. Savers, ordinary people who have a savings bank account in the bank, they say that interest rates are low, interest rates are much lower than inflation rate, and why you're not raising rates. On the other hand, if I go to an industry association and talk there, they complain that rates are very high, why don't you reduce rates? So this is a dilemma that we have to manage. Savers want high interest rates, investors and borrowers want low interest rates. You cannot at the same time give savers a high interest rate and borrowers a low interest rate. So we have to manage this, and again our position is that interest rates have to be raised, but eventually we will get back to an equilibrium when interest rates will be competitive with the rest of the world. That's the first part of my talk, which is talking about India and the crisis. Now I want to spend about 15-20 minutes talking about some lessons of the crisis. I will do this quickly and get through as many as I can. A lot is being written about the lessons of the crisis. There's an economist, Schumpeter. You heard of them? Most of the students? Creative destruction. So they say that out of this destruction, create a new financial world. But some people say that, look, it's too early. We still, part of the world is still in a crisis. It's too early to draw lessons of the crisis. When Zhou Enlai, who was Prime Minister of China, he was asked, that was in the 70s, he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to say. So some people say that it's too early to draw the lessons of the crisis. But as policymakers, we do not have the luxury of sitting back and waiting for the lessons to be drawn and the books to be written. Some of you will perhaps do PhDs on this crisis. Some of you will write books on this. But as policymakers, we have to get on and start learning the lessons of the crisis, even as we're still partly fighting the crisis. The first lesson I want to talk about is that in a globalizing world, decoupling does not work. In the years before the crisis, this used to be a very favorite phrase, decoupling, which is to say that emerging economies, you know which are the emerging economies? India, China, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, emerging economies have decoupled from the rest of the world, which is to say that even if advanced economies went into a crisis, the emerging economies will not be hit by the crisis. The reason being that over the decade of the 90s, emerging economies had built up foreign exchange reserves, they had built up resilient financial sectors, they had improved their macroeconomic management policies. The decoupling hypothesis was unconvincing even before the crisis, and the crisis completely debunked the hypothesis, because all emerging economies, including India, as I told you, were affected by the crisis. Why does decoupling not work? Decoupling does not work precisely because the whole world is interconnected now. There's trade, there's finance, there is people, there is ideas traveling from one country to another. There are professors of economics here who will tell you that if a crisis originates in a non-tradable sector of an economy, it doesn't cross borders. Only if a crisis is in a tradable sector does it cross borders. And textbooks also indicate housing as an example of a non-tradable sector, which is very surprising that a crisis that originated in a quintessentially non-tradable sector like housing became a global housing crisis, became a global banking crisis, became a global financial crisis, and then became a global economic crisis. All because there is financialization of globalization. Globalization takes place no longer just through trade, but through finance. The big question after the crisis is, does decoupling work? Have emerging economies decoupled? We are less confident now. The response before the crisis was, yes, we are decoupled. The response after the crisis is that it's more nuanced, which is that decoupling works sometimes, but it does not work sometimes. There is a trend to decoupling, which is that even if advanced economies are slowing down, emerging economies will tend to grow fast. But there is a cyclical coupling, which is that if there is a downward cycle around the world, emerging economies too will be hit by a downward cycle. The second lesson I want to talk about, which is that global imbalances need to be redressed for the sake of global stability. No crisis as complex as the one we've gone through had a simple or a single cause. This crisis was caused by several factors. In fact, when you probably students here start teaching, textbooks in economics will write about, like we talked about ACE and BCE now, after Christ, before Christ, the ACE and BCE. The textbooks in economics will talk about before Lehman and after Lehman. Okay, because the world has changed a lot between them. But two fundamental causes of the crisis were global imbalances and developments in the financial sector. In a way, those two fundamental causes are actually interlinked, and I'll tell you why. Why did global imbalances get built up? Very briefly, they got built up because Asia was producing, exporting to Europe and to America, earning money, getting that money. So they had a current account surplus. America was consuming more than it produced. America was running a deficit. So Asia produced, America consumed. Asia had current account surplus, America had a current account deficit. It went on for some time. Then there was, in the decade of the 90s, globalization of trade, of finance, and of labor. Global trade expanded phenomenally in the decade of the 90s. For example, global trade as a percent of the GDP was 34% in 1980, went up to 51% in 2007. Similarly, I have a number for global finance, how much it expanded. What is most significant, of course, is the globalization of labor. What happened in the 80s and 90s is that first China in the 80s and then India in the 90s joined the global labor force. So there was about 3 billion additional workers to the same amount of capital. Together, that capital and this additional labor improved global productivity. So the entire world had quite steady growth, low inflation. Everybody was having a good time in the early 2000s. But this current account surplus of Asia and the current account deficit of the US could not be sustainable. What happened was that as America ran a deficit and as East Asian economies ran a surplus, the global balances would have adjusted if they had allowed the currencies to appreciate. But they did not do that. They started acquiring foreign exchange. So they had foreign exchange reserves, which if they had invested around the world in a diversified portfolio, that would have been okay. But instead, what they did was they invested that in government treasuries. So there was surplus here, which was being invested in government treasury in America. America was borrowing at the low rates, and everybody was perpetuating these imbalances. What then happened was that the global interest rates came down because of too much money. When global interest rates came down, like all of you here, if your bank is giving you a low rate of interest, what will you do? You will try to find other sources of investment where you'll get a slightly higher rate of interest. But that will be more risky than putting money in a bank. But that's exactly what happened. Americans, Europeans, they found that there was a lot of money. There was very low interest rates in the formal financial system, so they started looking for opportunities for getting higher returns from their money, which caused this whole mispricing of risk and low standards of credit. Today, are global imbalances coming down after the crisis? It's not certain. For some time during the crisis, global imbalances had come down, but they're building up once again. So one of the important lessons we have to take away from this is that we need to make sure that global imbalances are restrained at a certain level. There is something called the mutual assessment process, which is going on in G20,
in order to make sure that global imbalances are managed properly, but that's another issue. The third lesson is about global problems require global coordination, which is that as the crisis started in the US, it spread around the world in two directions. One from America to Europe and to the rest of the world. Second, from housing to other sectors or other productive sectors of the economy. And countries in the beginning, Lehman collapsed on the 15th of September. For the first 2 months, every country tried to douse the fires on its own. But very soon they realized that each country trying to contain and manage the crisis was not working. So a realization dawned that this is a global crisis. Countries have to manage this crisis together. They have to coordinate their policies. So the G20 met first in November 2008 in Washington in the last month of President Bush's presidency. But the turning point of the crisis was the London G20 meeting in April 2009, when actually there was a coordinated effort across the rich world, including emerging economies, about monetary and fiscal stimulus. Now, as we emerge out of the crisis, there are again doubts about the efficacy of G20. I attend these G20 meetings, and now the stereotype view is that G20 was quite effective. It's solving the crisis, but as we get out of the crisis, it's losing its effectiveness. Possibly that is maybe quite true, but you cannot expect the same sense of urgency to manage what is a problem of recovery or what is a peacetime problem as you would expect in solving a wartime problem. There was urgency required during the crisis, which they showed. Of course, as we get out of the crisis, differences across countries, differences in interest are surfacing, but I'm hoping that we will be able to manage these differences. Today, G20 agenda, we talked about global imbalances, protectionism, currency wars, commodity prices, Basel III, etc., which Basel III is about all countries having a similar regulatory regime. I'll skip this lesson 4 and also lesson 5 for want of time. I'll go straight to lesson 6, which is capital controls are not only unavoidable, but advisable in certain circumstances. Capital flows have been a high-profile problem. All of you must have read about currency wars, which is that certain emerging economies were agitated with a lot of money coming in, their currencies appreciating, and they're losing their competitiveness. We had that problem too before the crisis, where a lot of capital coming into the country, much in excess of our requirement, and therefore our rupee was appreciating. When rupee appreciates, exporters are hurt, and they used to complain to the government, and they used to come and express their grievance to the Reserve Bank that the rupee's appreciation must be stopped. So, capital flows are a problem for emerging economies. We do need capital flows, but we only need so much that is good for our current account deficit, to meet our current account deficit. Our current account deficit is what we earn abroad and what we spend abroad. The difference between that is our current account deficit. We need just so much, which is enough to fill that balance. But we were getting far too much more than we required. So if you get too much capital, managing that becomes a problem. That is the grievance of the emerging economies. If a lot of capital comes in and we don't do anything at all, as I told you, the exchange rate appreciates, rupee appreciates, and that hurts exports. If we intervene in the foreign exchange market and buy that dollars, We can prevent, maybe we can prevent appreciation, but that infuses too much rupee liquidity and that causes inflation. Then the alternative for us is to suck that rupee liquidity, which is that we say sterilize. But if we sterilize, interest rates go up, and that again hurts competitiveness. So there is no completely benign solution. Whatever you do, if you don't intervene, if you intervene and not sterilize, or if you intervene and sterilize, no matter what you do, you hurt. So the challenge for us is really to determine what should be done, how much should be done, and when. Of course, there is a law of capital flows, which is that you never get the exact amount of money at the exact time you want. You always either get more or less. So, in India, we have a current account deficit. We want capital flows. We just want so much capital flows that are necessary for bridging our current account deficit. But the type of capital we want is also important. We have an express preference for direct investment, which stays for a long time, rather than portfolio capital, which invests in the Mumbai market and goes away at short notice. That is fickle. We have a preference for equity capital versus debt capital. So our policy is geared towards ensuring that we get more steady capital. Last year was a bad year because, as some of you may have seen or heard about it, our foreign direct investment had actually gone down compared to the year before. Whereas we thought initially that, okay, the world is recovering from the crisis, maybe it is an effect of the crisis. But foreign investment into other Asian economies had actually gone up last year. Into India, it had gone down. This year, the signs are more optimistic. We are hoping that we will be able to catch up. So, capital flows are a difficult problem to manage. I just want you to understand the challenge of managing capital flows. This lesson, which is that economics is not physics, which is, a few months after the crisis, the Queen of England went to the London School of Economics, and just as all these ladies lined up to welcome me here, economists in the London School of Economics lined up to welcome the Queen. And she met each of them and said, how come none of you saw the crisis coming? And all the economists went into a huddle. They went shamefaced and went red in their face and said, went very apologetic. Actually, the crisis discredited the reputation of economics. Remember, before the crisis, all these books that were coming out, Freakonomics and Tipping Point, trying to explain obscure problems that we never thought of, like have you ever thought of this question, why do drug dealers live with their mothers? Or what is common between sumo wrestlers and school teachers? We don't think of this question, we think of answers to this. But economists thought of all these questions before the crisis and started answering them, and they became cult figures. So economics started shaping itself like physics. The belief was that you must be able to reduce everything to mathematical equations and treat and impressive professors were those who could teach quantitative economics, reduce all everyday economics to math, and impressive students or achiever students were those who could write economics in math. But economics is not physics, because as much as there are some similarities between economics and physics, there are distinct differences. Physics deals with physical universe. Laws of physics are immutable, whereas the laws of economics deals with the real world. It depends on the behavior of people. Laws of economics change depending on the context, depending on the time, depending on the people. For example, the mass of an electron does not change depending on whether I'm here or in Mumbai or in New York. But I can't change the mass of an electron by my behavior. I can't change the price of a derivative by my behavior. Similarly, laws of physics, they say that, investment has to be equal to savings. That's the law of economics. But that need not be true. Neoclassical economics and economics that came later proved that investment need not be equal to savings. So there is a difference between economics and physics. Economics is real life, deals with people, deals with people's behavior. Even this crisis, when people see it did not predict it, that is not completely true. Some people did predict the crisis. They thought there would be a currency crisis, that the dollar would collapse. In the event, it imploded as a financial crisis. It's really difficult to say in a real world system how a crisis might implode. So, in economics, in dealing with the real world, you have to be aware that it is a function of human behavior, and therefore you have to be sensitive to that. Today, the US debt crisis that Sri Murthy spoke about, I just saw that President Obama made a statement that they've reached some sort of a solution. But the US debt crisis could have impacted us if there was shake-up in confidence around the world, if there was a flight to safety. There would have been deleveraging around the world, including in India, and that would have affected both the dollar movement as well as capital flows around the world. So what happens anywhere, how politicians, how people behave, any part of the world affects us. It doesn't affect the mass of an electron. Okay. The last thing I want to say, which is that having a sense of history is important in learning economics. There is this book by Rogoff and Reinhardt, which is, this time it's different, 800 years of financial folly. What these two people, Reinhardt and Rogoff, did was they studied the history of crisis over 800 years, and they found that the fundamental causes of each of these crises over the last 800 years are the same. But every time you go and ask policymakers, you go and ask economists, you go and ask analysts, why are we having a crisis? Why have we not learned from the past crisis? Economists, analysts, policymakers say this time is different. The world has changed. That's why we could not foresee this crisis coming. What Reinhardt and Rogoff show is that the world has not changed. The fundamental causes have always been the same. We have not learned the lessons of the crisis. The reason I'm signing off on this final note is that, as President Murthy said, as is the common belief, that we came out of this crisis relatively unscathed. But that does not mean that India is forever insulated from all future crises. There will be crises around the world, there will be crises in India. Our effort should be to prevent a crisis, and should a crisis actually occur, we must be able to minimize the impact of the crisis. So I want to stop there. I couldn't get through all the lessons of the crisis, but I've given you some sense of what we've gone through, how India experienced the crisis, what we did or did not do to manage the crisis, the post-crisis situation, the dilemmas that we've confronted in terms of managing growth and inflation, and some of the more enduring lessons that we must be carrying, not only as policymakers. I'm at the end of my career, but I'm talking about all the youngsters here who will go on to positions of responsibility in the government, in the public sector, in the private sector, in the voluntary sector, wherever you go and work. remember that you need to learn lessons. Every day there is no end to learning. I was once on a plane. When I'm on a flight, I don't normally talk to people next to me. I'm a quiet person, so I tend to keep to myself with a newspaper or read some book or just quietly sit down there. And so when you're quiet, you know the person next to you also doesn't disturb you. Some people, of course, are intrusive. But most people, you know, they find that you're quite reserved, so they leave you alone. So when I was coming on a flight once from Mumbai to Hyderabad, I was 45 or 50 at that time, and there was this young girl sitting next to me, and she left me alone. Then they started serving breakfast. So then we were having breakfast, and she said, "Sir, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Where do you work?" I told her where I worked and what I did, and then we kept chatting, and then she told me that she worked in ICICI, and I told her I was 10 in the World Bank actually, so I told her about the World Bank, about what I did here in Andhra Pradesh. Then after the flight landed, she said, "Thank you very much, sir, and, for all the conversation." She said, "Sir, I travel quite a lot. And I've made a decision that whenever I travel, I'm going to talk to the person next to me, because that's a great way of learning. You know, the person next to you on a plane or on a train is somebody you don't, unless it's your wife, you can't avoid. Otherwise, somebody at random. He could be a leprosy doctor, he could be an electrical engineer, he could be a minister, he could be anyone. So it's a great way of learning. So the final message I want to give to the students here is that there is no end to learning, there is no shortcut to success. I want to wish you all the very best. And once again, I want to thank you for inviting me.
Please give him a standing ovation. A very brilliant lecture we have had, a very thought-provoking. Please give him a standing ovation.
Good evening, sir. Questions? Yeah, sir. This is Praveen here from Geetup School of International Business. I have a question for you. The question is, sir, do you advise creation of central counterparties for all OTC derivatives for prevention of future financial crisis?
It's difficult for, the answer will be different from an India perspective and from the global perspective. One of the elements of the G20 package, is that all OTC derivatives must be on a central counterparty, because that is risk mitigating. Most of our derivatives, most of our financial products are on central counterparties. There are some which are not, for reasons that they cannot be brought, they're not standardized enough to be brought on a CCP platform. But even some products like corporate bonds, we're now saying that they must be reported to a platform. So I have no straightforward answer to your question, but the world will be a much safer place if all derivatives are brought as much as possible to central counterparties.
The second question, please.
Good evening. Good evening, sir. Would you please share with us a couple of early warning signals to detect ensuing financial crisis?
I wish I knew, but see, one is that, as I said, the thrust of my talk really is to pick up warning signals, pick up alert notices. One is that leverage should not build up beyond a point, which is that if there is too much borrowing, okay, by companies, by individuals, by everybody, that is a warning signal. If all financial institutions, particularly banks, are getting pro-cyclical, that is, they're all lending to the same sector, that is a warning signal, which is really what happened before the crisis, which was that a lot of lending was going to the housing sector. Everybody thought that house prices only go up, they never come down. In India too, we thought that house prices don't come down, but there is expectation that prices have come down or will come down. So pro-cyclicality, too much of leverage. In fact, one of the signals is that if there is too much stability also, I would tend to worry. In one of my lectures, I said that the period of great moderation before the crisis